This is The First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the first century. Episode 35. Gaius's double triumph, shortly after his birthday. After his so-called military achievements and successes in Germany, Gaius thought it would be a good idea to invade Britannia, as Julius Caesar had done decades ago. So Gaius led the armies to the coast of what we today call the English Channel. And after some time, the princeps simply ordered his troops to gather seashells as booty for Rome. In honor of this victory, he built a lighthouse similar to that at Pharos, port of Alexandria, Egypt, before departing on his way back to Rome. And as an aside, the lighthouse Gaius erected in modern-day Bologna stood for more than 16 centuries until it was washed away by the sea on the 29th of July, 1644. Gaius eventually arrived in Rome on his birthday, August 31st, 40 CE. And then he celebrated a double triumph, one for his victories in Germany and one for his victories in Britannia. And he displayed the seashells as bounty. It had been more than 20 years since he had participated in his father's triumph on May 26, 17 CE, celebrating that victory over the Germans. At that time, Gaius was only 4 years old, riding in the chariot with his father and siblings. Now, Gaius had his own double triumph, though with his parents dead and his siblings either dead or in prison, soon to be exiled. Even so, the glory was now all his, and his alone. After the spectacle of the double triumph, Gaius turned abruptly from celebration to vengeance. He convened a dramatic trial, accusing Lepidus, Agrippina, and Julia Livilla of plotting his assassination. He produced what he claimed was damning evidence, letters detailing the conspiracy and the very daggers allegedly meant to end his life. The performance left little doubt as to the verdict. All three were condemned. Lepidus was executed without delay. Agrippina and Julia Livilla, however, were spared death only to face a harsher, lingering punishment, banishment to the desolate island of Pontus, modern-day Ponza. But the purge did not end there. Tigellinus, already rumored to have had an improper relationship with Agrippina, was likewise swept up in the fallout, and he was exiled. Gaius treated the affair not as an internal reckoning, but as a military victory. To mark Lepidus's death, he rewarded his soldiers with gifts, as though they had triumphed over a foreign enemy. The 3 daggers, grim symbols of the alleged plot, were ceremoniously dedicated in the temple of Mars Ultor, which means Mars the Avenger, transforming the episode into an almost sacred vindication of imperial justice. For Agrippina, the punishment was deeply personal. Torn from her husband and infant son, who was entrusted to the care of Domitia Lepida, she was subjected to a calculated humiliation. Gaius forced her into exile, carrying the urn containing Lepidus's ashes. The gesture was both cruel and pointed. It echoed a haunting memory from their own past, when Agrippina and Gaius had watched their mother bear the ashes of their father Germanicus. Now, Agrippina was compelled to reenact that sorrowful ritual, but with the remains of her disgraced lover and supposed co-conspirator. In a final act of repudiation, Gaius moved to erase the elevated status once granted to his sisters. Honors that had previously distinguished them were effectively frozen. No further distinctions would be permitted for any members of his family. What had begun as a celebration of imperial glory ended instead in fear, spectacle, and the public dismantling of his own house. Herod Agrippa also made his way back to Rome, to be near the center of action. He found Judea to be much too boring for his liking. Agrippa wanted to honor Gaius, and so he put together an extravagant banquet. In many ways, Agrippa was still living beyond his means, and this dinner was no exception. He spared no expense, and Gaius noticed. To thank him, Gaius complimented him on his loyalty and then said, "You deserve the best. Name it, it's yours." Gaius expected that Agrippa might ask for more territory or an increased take of the tax revenue, but to his surprise, Agrippa demurred. He said that Gaius had already been so generous with him that it was his pleasure to host this simple dinner in his honor. As Gaius kept insisting, Agrippa responded with a clever request. He said, "I'll ask you for something that will bring you a reputation for piety and will induce the deity to help you in everything that you wish. I ask you to abandon all further thought of erecting the statue which Petronius has your orders to set up in the temple of the Jews." With so many witnesses, Gaius acceded to the request. He wrote to Petronius, saying that if he had not yet erected the statue, he should drop the project. It was only a few weeks later that Gaius received a letter sent from Petronius months earlier. That letter was seeking further clarification, as the Jews were so adamantly opposed to a statue of Gaius being placed in the temple. Though Petronius had written it much earlier, its arrival and opening had been delayed due to Gaius's military adventures. But now reading this letter only infuriated Gaius, and he dashed off a message instructing Petronius to commit suicide for being such a soft, incompetent legate. Now in exile at the island of Pontus, Agrippina spent her days in a leisurely manner, never knowing if she might be executed at the whim of her brother. She knew that her uncle, Nero Caesar, had been exiled to this same island about 10 years earlier, and he died there on orders of Tiberius. Though exiled, Agrippina still had her servants, and she kept up with news from Rome. She imagined what life would be like if she ever were allowed to return to Rome. She promised herself that she would not be in this position ever again. Her sister-in-law, Domitia Lepida, was looking after her young boy, and from the letters it seemed as though she was doting on him, maybe even spoiling him. Agrippina also enjoyed a daily swim in the Mare Nostrum, which was their word for the Mediterranean Sea. Mare Nostrum in Latin means our sea. And she became such a proficient and conditioned swimmer that she could be in the water for hours. That time in the salt water and fresh breeze was the most conducive to her planning an eventual return to Rome. Now that Gaius was back from his so-called campaign in Britain, the Senate found itself in an awkward position. They didn't know whether to praise him or keep quiet. Lavish praise for an achievement that had accomplished little, or really nothing at all, would only make them look ridiculous, as if they were mocking the emperor rather than honoring him. Gaius, however, took their restraint as an insult. So when he came back to Rome, he had nearly the entire Senate put to death for failing to declare him a god. In another sign of his cruelty, after ordering one man to be executed, Gaius forced the victim's father to stand by and watch, even though the father had committed no crime and had never been summoned to court. When the desperate man asked if he might at least be allowed to close his eyes so as not to witness his son's execution, Gaius had him killed as well. The son, certain that his own life was about to end, tried to save himself by pretending that he was actually part of a conspiracy that was meant to assassinate the emperor. He offered to name all the others involved in this conspiracy, and he began accusing Gaius's closest companions and those who encouraged his excesses and cruelty. But the man went too far, accusing even the powerful freedman Callistus and even Gaius's wife Caesonia. That was enough to make his claims unbelievable, and he was executed shortly thereafter. But the atmosphere of fear and suspicion his case created would ultimately help bring about Gaius's own downfall. Gaius also enjoyed toying with the crowds, sometimes rewarding them and at other times murdering others. The people often would line up or reserve a seat in the circus, prior to the games the next morning. Unfortunately, their commotion might awaken Gaius, who would then order them to be dispersed, and occasionally some of the revelers would end up dead at the hands of soldiers. One time, standing high above the crowd one afternoon, Gaius hurled silver and gold coins down into the masses. The scramble turned deadly. According to some accounts, iron pieces were mixed in with the coins, and in the chaos nearly 300 people were crushed or killed. Watching this spectacle was the officer with that high-pitched voice, Cassius Dio, the same who was given the order to torture the innocent Quintilia. We talked about him in previous episodes, including episodes 26 and 28. He was tribune of the Praetorian Guard, named so by Gaius. The emperor knew him from when he was a boy, and the soldiers under his father Germanicus's command mutinied after Augustus died in 14 CE. Cassius Dio distinguished himself at that time by cutting down many of the mutineers. After Gaius became emperor and made him head of the Praetorian Guard, he would often mock and tease him for being effeminate. When Dio would ask for the daily watchword, Gaius would reply with sexually suggestive terms, so that when Dio passed on the watchword to his soldiers, they would laugh at such words coming from such an effeminate voice. If Dio ever thanked Gaius, the emperor would extend his hand to be kissed, and then move it in obscene ways. Now, seeing the emperor mistreat the crowds from such a high point, Dio had a sudden, chilling realization. How easy it would be to simply shove Gaius over the edge and end it all in an instant. In early January of 41, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, husband of the exiled Agrippina, passed away in Pyrgi, on the western coast of central Italy, due to dropsy. In his will, he left 1/3 of his estate to his son Lucius. Lucius was being raised by Domitia Lepida, Ahenobarbus' sister. Gaius, however, stepped in and claimed that portion of the inheritance for himself. Next time, we'll hear about how Gaius' actions finally catch up with him, and he is assassinated.